Former U.S. Representative and current Commissioner at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, Frank Wolf, joins us now to give us a better understanding of what's happening in Nicaragua right now. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's start off with why. Why do you think Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega released the prisoners?
Well, I think it was a sign of weakness, number one. Number two, USCIRF and the State Department and many others have been pushing Ortega, and I think he sort of felt an obligation to do it. But keep in mind, I just saw a report that yesterday 94 additional people were stripped of their citizenship. So I think I also saw a report. One human rights activist said yesterday, he said, the country, Nicaragua, is on the verge of becoming the Western Hemisphere's equivalent of North Korea. I admire Bishop Alvarez, the fact that he would not leave. I think that took a lot of courage. I mean, that was so strong of him. Ortega has done this before. Ortega did this back in the 80s. He's recreating and coming back. Keep in mind, too, China is now involved down there in Nicaragua. So I think it's important for the Congress to hold hearings, not hearings just about what's going on, but on what they should be doing about it. Secondly, I think there ought to be a gathering of all the groups that care deeply about Nicaragua and also Cuba to come up with a policy and actually things that you can do to change what's going on down there in Nicaragua.
A regional approach. Well, let's talk about, you were saying pushing and pushing. Let's tease out some of that. The U.S. has placed sanctions on Ortega, multiple Nicaraguan officials, and on industries to block U.S. companies from investing in Nicaragua. Is this enough?
No, it's not enough, because you're seeing these actually getting worse. I think you have to do a comprehensive thing, but I think you need congressional hearings to bring some of these people in to testify. These are patriots. They want to go back to Nicaragua. Many still have family back there, to come over the constructive thing of what you can do. It's just not enough to have a press release or the State Department to say something. I think you have to have a policy. We were able to, Pope John Paul, who frankly should have gotten the Nobel Prize for the defeat of communism, he and Ronald Reagan brought down communism in Poland and Romania. I think the church, working with those who care deeply about this, we can bring about a change. But USCIRF has been speaking out, advocating for it. But I think the Congress has to get involved. But people who really understand what's going on have to help educate the Congress, educate the administration on what can be done to actually change the government.
And you just called Bishop Alvarez courageous. He turned down the opportunity to be released to the U.S. As Catholics, we see a leader who's staying with his flock. What message does this send to Ortega, a former guerrilla leader who campaigned on anti-church sentiment?
I think it sends a very strong message that the Catholic Church, and he is an individual, are very strong. Also, it sends a message to the flock. It sends a message to religious leaders all over the world. So I think it's a very courageous thing. He could have gotten on the plane. He could have gotten on the plane with the other 222 land at Dulles Airport. We live in McLean or in Miami now. But he didn't do it. And so I really commend him. I think it's a strong action. But I think now, in order to encourage him, I think the United States government and all the groups have to do more than just say, this is a bad thing. There has to be a policy as to change what's going on. Ortega has done this before. This is not the first time the Ortega and his wife have done these things. Any government that expels a missionary or charities, Mother Teresa's group, is not a good government.
Now, you mentioned the stripping of citizenship. In addition to 26 years in prison, they also stripped the bishop of his Nicaraguan citizenship. How does this complicate things, or is this just an effort to further humiliate him?
I think it's just an effort to humiliate him, and I think Ortega's being a bully. Don't forget, the Sandinistas in the past, Ortega has done this before. This is not I remember once going down to a meeting with Ortega back in the late 80s. Ortega has a history of doing these things. And now I think there's some other thing we have to realize. China is now involved down there in Nicaragua. And China is up to no good in Nicaragua. China is up to no good in Cuba. And China is up to no good in many other places around the world. But I think a strong, almost the way that Ronald Reagan and Pope John Paul did with regard to communism in Poland, communism in Romania. We can do this. And this is in our own hemisphere. You can get on an airplane in Washington and be in Nicaragua in a couple hours. You could have lunch in Washington and dinner in Nicaragua. We have an obligation to the people of Nicaragua to do something. Lastly, you almost have a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. China is involved in Cuba. Cuba's 90 miles off our coast. It's like going from Washington to Wilmington. I mean, and the same thing with regard to the foreign governments getting involved in Nicaragua. There needs to be a policy, a bipartisan policy. The Congress has to come together and hold hearings to educate people, but also to educate members of Congress. And last thing I would encourage, I think it'd be very helpful for a congressional delegation, Republicans and Democrats, to on the next recess break. It's not very far. Sometimes it's closer to Nicaragua than to their own congressional district, to go down and see firsthand, asked to go into the prison to meet with Bishop Alvarez. Wouldn't it be great to have 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats to go down to Nicaragua land, tell Ortega they want to go in and meet the bishop in prison, to meet with the dissidents? That would be something very powerful. Lastly, there needs to be a convening of all the groups that care deeply to come up with a set policy. And lastly, I might say USCIRF has said that this country ought to be a CPC country, country of particular concern because of what they're doing. But this is going to take more than just a statement. I think there needs to be action.
Well, absolutely. We'll be looking for that action. We're so grateful for your leadership on USCIRF and also for your legacy leadership in Congress. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.